The subject of my talk today, Mozart's late piano works. Last year I was here and I had the honor of speaking here about some of the ways in one might go about completing a Mozart fragment, of which there are a lot, I must say. But I'm happy that the talk for today is a little bit more on topic when it comes about when it concerns pianos. And I would like to start with a quote from one of my favorite operettas by Gilbert and Sullivan, the American. The Mikado, is to say, I have a little list. And that list was compiled by me by a friend of mine who studies momentarily at the Conservatory of Jerusalem, who's studying musicology there. And his name is Yehuda Roman, and he has a very profound knowledge, I must say, of the discography of the last 20, 30 years, which is to say the recordings that were made on period pianos. I don't know anyone who has as many recordings and who is as up to date as he is as to what has been done in the last 3 decades on that field. Especially when it comes to Mozart's music. And by this, of course, with period pianos, I mean not on a Pleyel, which can be a very beautiful experiment, I think. But of course, I'm talking about recordings made on pianos from the late 18th century, either originals or copies. Now, that list he gave me is not complete, and it will never be, of course, because new recordings are coming out every week or so. But we were incredibly surprised to see on this list of recordings that is as complete as can be expected, and to see that a huge amount of recordings done of Mozart's music is done on the pianos built by Anton Walter from Vienna. Now, to clarify myself here, these recordings constitute about 70% of the entire discography when it comes to Mozart's piano works on period instruments. About 70% of them is done either on the few remaining originals by Walter that we have, on copies. The vast majority of the recording is done on those. I have to say, we'll talk a bit more about that, I hope, but that most of those copies were made in the beginning of the 19th century and do not really reflect Walter's work when he met Mozart. There are some notable exceptions, of course. And the other is an amount of recordings done on pianos that could be comfortably, I think, called Walter's in anything but name, by which I mean, no disrespect of course, but by which I mean that these instruments greatly follow the school, if you will, of this Viennese builder. And so I got this list and I got the idea to write an article about it. Hopefully by the end of this year it will be finished and published. And again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to present it here. So part of this talk will be from reading a little from the article, and at some point I will be diverting from the written path and discuss certain subjects as they come up. Now I have to, in 40 minutes distill somewhat the general viewpoints on these types of pianos, the ones made by Andreas Stein in Augsburg and those made by Gabriel Anton Walter in Vienna. So I do not say here that the views that I'm about to express, I'm going to read you 1 or 2 quotes, that they represent everybody's view on these pianos, merely that they are, that they seem to be symbolic, or symbolic I should say, for the kind of way people are looking at this piano. So I don't think it's a good idea to name names doing that. I will do so sometimes, but not here. But this is a quote. If you really want to know who it is, I'll tell you. But I don't think it's a good idea for one musician to go bad-mouthing another. So I'll just give you the quote. And I quote, "What I discovered is that Stein's pianos are perfect for early Mozart and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. It is just amazing how clear the division is in Mozart's works. While early opuses sound much better on a Stein piano, his later music doesn't sound good on this instrument. Stein has a more light, girlish voice color, which sounds too naive in later works. It would be the equivalent of using a 14-year-old to play the role of Medea or Lady Macbeth. Early works sound much better on the Stein again, although I should admit that some pieces, for example, she says here, the D major sonata with the finale alla turca. I'm assuming she's talking about the A major sonata. I didn't truly understand before, but with the Stein piano it is coming by itself. Now I've chosen, end quote, I've chosen this quote because it is most extreme, I would say, in naming that divide. Presumably by a clear divide in Mozart's works, she means Mozart's move to Vienna in 1781, everything he wrote for the piano after that, and everything he wrote for the piano before that. This is quite an extreme quote, but I have to tell you, we don't have time to go through the collection I made of all. Yeah, it is all. So, but that's all the clues I'm going to give you. So that's about half the population of the world there, and I wish you could. But there we go. So again, presumably by the dividing Mozart's work, she means his later Vienna years and his earlier years when he was in Mannheim and München and Augsburg and of course Salzburg, all over Europe actually. Now I am very fortunate to have quite a large collection of books on Mozart. In fact, the collection I have, only the biographies on this composer, now exceeds 1,600 titles, to the great horror of my partner. But there it is. So I was able to dig in those books written in the last 10 years, where Mozart's piano works and the pianos he played on are mentioned. This is not such a rare view to find. Actually, it is quite common to find pianists of this day who play these instruments to say, well, probably these instruments by Walter are the best. And I don't think it's very hard to see why they might come to that conclusion. Because the instrument that is supposed to have been Mozart's is today preserved not in Mozart's Geburtshaus in Salzburg, but in the Mozart Wohnhaus on the Makartplatz. In the Geburtshaus is a very good copy of that instrument. And that is the first slide, by the way. So hey presto, there it is. That's Mozart's Walter piano, which we think he must have bought somewhere around 1782, probably not 1781, because by that time he still had to borrow a piano. We'll get to that. And, you know, I think you can see why people would think, you know, because Mozart owned one of these instruments, suddenly all the music from this period would sound better on an instrument like this. You even come across viewpoints that say, well, from this point onward, he only composed with the sound of this instrument in mind. This was his favorite instrument, and he preferred Walter pianos over Stein pianos and all other pianos. Well, I'm not a big fan of that theory, and here's why. If you follow that logic true, then if I were to drop that right now, and you were to ask yourself, well, what car does this guy like best, you would come to the conclusion that my favorite car in the whole world, and the car I think about when I think about driving, is a 1991 Volkswagen Caddy. Please do not believe that that is my favorite car, simply because I own one. I mean, pragmatism and practicality, money, everything comes into play here. There's also what I would like to show you in a few moments. And I should say, I was planning on skipping this, but I decided to put it in anyway. Again, think of this list of recordings, of which about 70% is done on these kinds of instruments, instead of the other beauties around. I mean, there's a thing sent from heaven right over there, which is excellent for Mozart, I think. Does not really follow the Walter school, if you will, because of the lack of a backcheck, stuff like that. But why not on instruments like that, or on those of Stein and even Mozart's late piano works? And I don't think they are to be left in Mozart's earlier works at all. I think we should pull them a bit forward. And again, this list represents, I think, in the discography, the general viewpoint of what instrument to choose for Mozart. Now, this should not become a competition between one builder and the other, and which builder walks away with the prize of building the instrument that is perfect for Mozart. Rather, my point is here that there is no such thing as a Mozart instrument. If we know anything about the diversity in the 18th century, we know that people played on clavichords and organs, on bigger pianos like these, concert pianos for the virtuosi, but most people had clavichords at their home. Harpsichords were still highly fashionable, and they were coming up with new devices all over the place, as we will see in a few seconds. So that's that. And I think that some of the things we do as period performers playing on this piano, not all of it, but I hope secretly that some of it might be inspired in some way as can be viewed as a silent critique on the Steinway use now that we see nowadays. Because if you go to a concert, you know, sometimes you encounter a Bösendorf or Yamaha, a very good one, or any other brand, but you know the Steinway is there and it's quite a stifling, dominating presence. I was hoping that the period piano business would offer a more varied approach to using these instruments. And actually what we see is that in these recordings, this kind of instrument is taking over the same role as the Steinway, which I don't think is a very good idea. I mean, let's stay diverse here. But that's that. At the beginning of my talk on Stein pianos, I should make mention of a letter that is very famous that Mozart wrote in 1777 to his father from Augsburg when he was visiting the workshop of Johann Andreas Stein. Now, I'm assuming here, going out on a limb, that most of you will know this letter. If not, I will paraphrase it for those of you who don't. Mozart visits Stein in his workshop, and he's very taken in by his instruments. He favors them over another kind that he used to favor before, that's Spatklavieren, he calls them. He says that the damper raising mechanism, the knee lever under the keyboard, is very good. He's very impressed by the sound, and basically the entire letter is a letter to his dad asking for the dough to buy him one. And one of the funny things I wanted to talk about is the soundboard Mozart mentions in these instruments. He mentions some of the ways Stein treats these soundboards in order so that they will not crack. And Mozart writes to his father and says, well, he puts them out in the rain and in the sun and in the blizzards, and he exposes them to all the devils of nature. And hell, even if they don't crack, then he cracks them himself, so he can glue in wedges to strengthen the soundboard. I think stuff like that might be best understood either as a sales pitch by Stein or an exaggeration by Mozart in order to persuade his father to buy one. And the reasons for doing so, I think, might be quite clear. I should mention also that none of the surviving instruments by Stein show the abuse that is described here. So if he did do it, then only the ones he didn't do it with survived. So that would be very odd. But again, the soundboard was something to discuss, obviously, because I think for those of us who own instruments of this kind, new ones or copies, it is quite clear that you have to be a little careful with them, especially in the winter when it gets dry. And you know, the air humidity drops below 30%, you're shaking all the time and thinking, oh my God, what will happen to my piano? Now, as a reminder, this is the 18th century and these things were transported on coaches, on unpaved dirt roads, really exposed to all the devils. So, I mean, again, the fact that so many of these instruments have survived is a miracle. And I think that a lot of soundboards in those times must have cracked also, because apparently this was a necessary topic to cover between Mozart and his father. Sticking on Stein a little, it's next slide. Here is 2 pages from a notebook by Johann Andreas Stein. And I show this to you because Mozart also mentions the price for one of these instruments in his letters to his father. And he says they're about 300 gulden. Now, I remain convinced that there is no such thing as a system that will allow to calculate how much money that would be nowadays. With 2 centuries of inflation, that's simply impossible. I do not believe such a thing to exist. But it was a lot of money, and so did Leopold Mozart think, apparently, because when he wrote back to his son about the piano, he said, and I quote, "I am glad that Herr Stein's pianofortes are so good, but indeed they are very expensive." And that was the end of the subject, so no Stein for Mozart. But this is 2 pages from Stein's notebook that he kept. And it is basically a list of instruments, and there are prices behind them. So we are to assume that these are the instruments he sold. And I would like to read some of the things that come up, because the list on these 2 pages of the notebook present us with invaluable clues and problems alike. The rather puzzling description of Flügel is notated by Stein. In the case of 3 instruments, along with reported selling prices of 50, 60, and 75 florins, which are a little at odds, I would say, with what the price Mozart reported. Additionally, he mentions the sale of 3 clavecins, one for 180, one for 200, and one for 250 guildens. On the second page, there's mention of a forte pay that sold for 200 gulden to the Archbishop of Salzburg, the one that ended up in such a row with Mozart himself. And there's another one for 250 guldens and a third one for 60 gulden. And as a final insult, I would say, to our modern day understanding of keyboard terminology in the 18th century, the term Grossflügel is mentioned. If anyone wants to tell me what that means, I'd be very grateful, because I have no idea. I've not been able to find it anywhere. But this instrument was sold to a certain Herr Bischof for 140 guldens. Now, it has been speculated that these terms, at least for Stein, refer to the different quality and size of each instrument, rather than specifying the exact type. Now, if that were to be the case, one can only marvel at the inconsistency of Stein's system of classification. A more probable explanation might be that Stein, in addition to building his own instruments, might very well have been buying and reselling those of other makers as well, fixing them and then reselling them, which would in some way account for these vastly different prices. And this is a distinct possibility, I think, because the list does not specify whether the instruments were made or just sold by Stein. This explanation would allow the terms forte pay and F pay to refer to the instruments that Mozart encountered in Stein's workshop in 1777, since they are notably different by means of their escapement mechanism and come closest to the 300 gulden reported by Mozart in his letter. I find it unlikely that Stein would have classified his instruments in exactly the same way as those by other makers, especially since we shall see in a few moments the difference was so enormous. So there's that. We already came across the Archbishop of Salzburg owning one of these instruments. And in fact, what I find very interesting, we're keeping on the topic of money here for a while, is that except for that letter from 1777, all the instances we find Mozart dealing with instruments by Stein, we find these costly instruments being owned by wealthy aristocracy. For example, on the 24th of December 1781, Mozart's playing was put against that of the celebrated clavier virtuoso Muzio Clementi in a competition organized by the Emperor Joseph II. The instrument Mozart used for this competition was lent to him by the Countess Maria Wilhelmina von Thun und Hohenstein, the Countess who most likely ordered her instruments from Stein during Stein's visit to Vienna later in 1777, had already offered to lend Mozart her instrument in April of 1781. Now, I think that the fact that Mozart, in what he called the land of the clavier, chose one of Stein's instruments for a competition against Vienna's most prominent clavier virtuoso in the presence of the Austrian emperor is often overlooked, but nonetheless, I think, clear evidence of his trust in their excellence. We have another mention of Stein, at least, in a letter from Mozart, which he sends to his niece. I said 1781 backward, that's not correct. This letter to Mozart's niece is from 1781. Maria Anna Tekle Mozart. And Mozart writes in this letter, "Oh, I must not forget, dearest and best cousin, would you please be so kind and take the enclosed letter to Herr Stein and ask him to give me an immediate answer, or at least give you a message that you can write to me." In this particular instance, Mozart was acting as a go-between for a certain Count Czernin, who wanted to order a piano from Stein. The question that rises here, if by this time Mozart might have encountered the pianos by Walter, then why write to Stein for this Count to buy a Stein piano for him, somebody who could afford the best? Now, we find a very similar situation, funny enough, of a composer, pianist-composer, I should say, broking a deal between a builder, I think, and a pupil who can buy a piano. And a very similar case exists in the form of Joseph Haydn and a woman named Maria von Genzinger. And in a letter from 1790, Haydn writes to her, "I am simply delighted that my prince intends to give your grace a new fortepiano. All all the more so since I am in some measure responsible for it. I constantly implore Mademoiselle Nanette to persuade your husband to buy one for your grace. And now the purchase depends entirely on your grace and simply consists in your grace in choosing one to fit your touch and suit your fancy. It is quite true that my friend Herr Walter is very celebrated. Now the quote stops here. I took this quote from an article by Eva Badura-Skoda called Prolegomena to a History of the Viennese Fortepiano. And I think it's very striking that she took this passage, this quote, and ended it here. Because a little earlier on in the article, she writes, but as concert instruments, they were also apparently superior to all other instruments. And this probably remained so for approximately 4 decades until 1810. Now, fortunately, I know the letters by Haydn, and I recognized this letter, and I knew that she had left part of this quote out. And I want to present it to you because I think it very strikingly shows exactly the problem we are addressing here, which is the endlessly biased ways in which these instruments, very good as they may be, are always put forward as the most suitable instrument for Mozart. Here is the original passage from Haydn with the dot behind the sentence. I go again. It is quite true that my friend Herr Walter is very celebrated and that every year I receive the greatest civility from that gentleman. But between ourselves, and speaking frankly, sometimes there is not more than one instrument in 10 which you could really describe as good. And apart from that, they are very expensive. So you find this sort of thing quite often. Things written about Walter pianos, Stein pianos, and some things that are, I think, quite important left out. She goes on to write in this article, Badura-Skoda, nevertheless, Walter's instruments were apparently for professionals the best concert instruments, the fortepiano for virtuosi in his days. This impression one gets indirectly also from the report by Schoenfeld in his Jahrbuch der Tonkunst. I have read that specific entry in the Jahrbuch der Tonkunst, and it reads here, her instruments, by which we are now talking about Nanette Streicher, the daughter of Andreas Stein, so we are talking about her here. But her instruments by this time were still mainly based on her father's design. Her instruments do not have the strength of those built by Walter, but they are unequaled in the balance of sound registers, the pureness, charm, grace, and softness of tone. I don't think those are bad characteristics to bring to Mozart playing. So at the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned that quote, and I wouldn't tell you who it was, and I still will not. But I would like to remind you of the girlish voice and the naive sound. Here's what Mozart himself apparently thought about the Stein instruments, because we have a diary entry from a certain Count Ludwig von Bentheim-Steinfort, who was present at a concert Mozart gave in Frankfurt on the 15th of October 1790. And he writes, Mozart played a concerto of his composition, which was of a gentilesse and an extraordinary charm. He had a fortepiano by Stein of Augsburg, which is supposed to be the foremost of its kind, and which costs 90 to 100 ducats. That is a little more than 300 guldens if you calculate it back, so he was beginning to ask more for them. And that instrument belonged to Madame Baroness de Frenz. Again, aristocracy able to afford these instruments. A little further here, we also read about Mozart's playing. He played a fantasy with no notes, by which this writer probably means that Mozart played from memory or he improvised. Most charming, in which he was infinitely brilliant, displaying all the force of his genius. So there is no trace here of a girlish voice that is too naive or the sound that is too light. Rather, it is Mozart at the true force, full force of his genius, playing infinitely brilliant. That sounds a lot better, I think. So Mozart himself apparently had no objection to using these concerts up until the end of his life. I think it's very puzzling that the two concertos Mozart is supposed to have played here, which is K537 and K459, you very seldom come across a recording of those concertos done in a Stein or even a live performance on them. I'm sure there have been, but I have up until now not been able to find one. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but means I haven't been able to find them. In 1783, another Viennese gentleman, someone other than Mozart, wrote about the Stein instruments, and he unfortunately only signed his name W.G., but he wrote to Kramer's Magazin der Musik, showing his discontent with certain new inventions, like the so-called clavecin royal. In his tirade against this instrument and other recent inventions of the same kind, he mentions the pianos of Stein, and I quote, "These gentlemen stuff their farm carts with straw and think they have invented a new carriage. If they knew the qualities of a Stein pianoforte, they would imitate it if they could, and throw away many of their own trivial inventions." Now, obviously, I do not mean to say that the pianos by Walter are trivial inventions, but again, here is a clear sign that these pianos, even in the second half of Mozart's piano career, if you could speak in those terms, after 1781, were enjoying some favoritism. So there's that. Now, despite of all this, the fact remains that Mozart did buy his instrument from Walter and not from Stein in around 1782. Now, that has been taken as a clear sign that Mozart's musical tastes must have shifted and that he now preferred an instrument like that of Walter. But I think it's a good idea to keep in mind some of the practical problems that people had again in this time. Mozart was living by that time in Vienna. If, hypothetically assuming he still wanted a piano by Stein, the first thing he would have needed to do was to take a 2-day journey to Augsburg, which is 500 kilometers away, pay for lodging, also of course on the way back pay for lodging and the travel, and also for the transport of that instrument. Now, if anything happened to the instrument on that journey, on paved dirt roads, when he came back to Vienna, the most suitable person to fix it, perhaps, would be back in Augsburg, 500 kilometers away. This all is, of course, assuming that by now Mozart was able to afford one of these instruments. I think it's very fair to say that Mozart might have simply chosen to buy locally, which would have, I think, made sense, because there is nothing wrong with this instrument. I've had the honor of playing it just a few, like 20 seconds last year, during the Mozartwoche when Robert Levin played it. It is a fantastic instrument. If you've never heard it before, you should go. There is something to say about modifications to it that have been made in the 19th century. But there it is. There is nothing wrong with these Walter-type pianos. But, you know, the pendulum has swung a little bit too far in their direction, I think. Now, that is one. Another thing you regularly come across that serves as a motivation to use these pianos by Walter is that they are supposed to have more volume, that they can fill bigger halls. And we read almost everywhere that the concert venues Mozart was playing in were getting bigger and that the orchestras were getting bigger. So if you could go to the next slide. This is one of those concert venues. That is, this is the original drawing.
3 or 4 minutes if possible.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Just because the schedule is completely...
Stop in 4 minutes?
If possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So this is one of those concert venues. Its size has been estimated in previous Mozart scholarship to be about 314 square meters. Now, luckily for me, you can just contact the Vienna City Archive and request the original building plans. Doing so, next slide please, also came across the earliest known existing photograph of the Treppenhof, which is there on the right. And the chapel, which was a refurbished, maybe I should say, chapel that Mozart played in, became a casino. How about that? Was in fact 87 square meters. So that is greatly exaggerated. The same goes for the houses of one of Mozart's, the father of one of Mozart's pupils, Joseph von Auenhammer, and another father of one of Mozart's pupils, Barbara von Ployer. All those concert venues were much, much smaller. And luckily nowadays, in the newest biographies coming out, you see this being corrected. The same is true for the orchestras. If we know anything about them in the 18th century, it is that they were not getting bigger, but that there was no such thing as a standardized orchestra. If you've never read Niels Zeslow's book on Mozart's symphonies, I implore you to do so. So there is no reason for a more powerful piano, and there's a lot more to say about this. We could learn something about the size of the audience and stuff like that. But to summarize here, I had to leave quite a few stuff out here, but I do hope that the next time, if you are a period pianist, if I can use that term, please don't make the assumption that just because Mozart owned one of these instruments, that means that he only wanted to play on those instruments, he favored them above all, and that he completely forgot about the Stein fortepiano. It just means Mozart had one, and it might very well have been financially motivated. So there's some food for thought. Thank you.